Subsidies for a domestic producer can also be used as a form of protectionism. However, it's unique because it doesn't place the burden on the consumer. They still enjoy the same prices they did before. Instead, the government will use expenditure, will spend money on the domestic producer to give them an advantage. To better explain a subsidy, I'll go through the steps on the graph. Starting from here, this is just the domestic market at equilibrium without factoring in the world market. Now, with the world market, consumers are paying price world, and they're consuming up to Q2. However, domestic production only is accounted up to Q1, from 0 to Q1. So this whole area here is consumption from imports. Now you can see that with the subsidy, supply has shifted to the right, and this here in red is the actual point of the subsidy. If you go up from where the subsidy line, the S2, intersects world supply, SW, go up until you reach supply 1, and then go all the way left. That is your government expenditure box. This here is the government expenditure, how much the government is spending on the subsidy to subsidize local producers. So after the subsidy, domestic production will shift from Q1 to Q3. So producers are now producing from 0 to Q3. However, consumers are still paying the same price that they were paying before, price world. This here is covered by the government. So the government effectively increases the output from local producers while protecting consumers. So despite the benefits to this form of protectionism, there are issues, both unique to subsidies and shared with other forms of protectionism. And you might be thinking, what's the catch? Because here, domestic producers can also export more. They're not only getting a larger share of the domestic market, they're also being able to export more since the government's subsidizing their production, therefore making them cheaper and able to compete with foreign companies, even in the export market. So what this does, it raises net exports. Since the domestic producers will be producing more, there will be less imports, and there's going to be higher exports since the subsidized businesses can compete offshore. So that can lead aggregate demand to rise. Of course, it also protects domestic industries, so it can protect employment. However, there are catches. The first one, here the government is spending money. You can see that in the government expenditure box. The subsidy is costly. So anytime that the government is spending money, a big factor to consider is opportunity and monetary cost. Monetary cost is just the actual cost of the subsidy. And the opportunity cost is what the government could have been investing in instead. For example, it could have invested in infrastructure or healthcare, which can have its own economic benefits in the short or long run, depending on what the government decides to invest in. The next area to consider with any form of protectionism, not just subsidies, is inefficiency. Because it's subsidizing domestic producers, which are more expensive for a reason, because they don't have comparative advantage on that good or service. So, with the subsidy, the government is sponsoring, funding inefficient production, so misuse of scarce resources. Finally, since subsidies can also raise exports, that gives them an unfair advantage in the global markets, so that can lead to retaliation or loss of goodwill between trading partners. So in economic analysis, you'll just have to weigh the pros and cons here. You can compare this to other forms of subsidies. It has benefit or other forms of protectionism. It has benefits over others in some ways. For example, the prices aren't raised, and therefore consumption doesn't fall. There's no loss in consumer surplus, which other forms of protectionism, like tariffs, you will see a fall in consumer surplus. So that's a pro. But then you have to consider that the government isn't making revenue here. They're losing revenue. So there's lots of dynamics to consider when you're evaluating forms of protectionism.